Hi, it's Melanie. Have you registered for my free class, The Top Kidney Stone Myths Debunked? On Thursday, July 18th, 2024 at noon Eastern, I'll be talking about all the most common and harmful kidney stone myths that I hear people talking about all the time. Just head to www.kidneystoneclass.com to reserve your seat. Even if you can't make it live, make sure to register for the class anyway, and I'll be sure to send you a link to watch the recording. Can't wait to see you there. Welcome to the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. I'm your host, registered dietitian and kidney stone expert, Melanie Betts. After learning a ton about kidney stones and helping people prevent stones at the University of Chicago, I was fed up with all the terrible advice people were finding online. So I decided to do something about it. The Kidney Dietitian was born. This podcast is for people who want to learn what actually works to prevent kidney stones and still enjoy life, eating, and their favorite foods. Let's dive in. Hello and welcome to the 51st episode of the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. I'm your host, registered dietitian and kidney stone expert, Melanie Betts. And today I am dedicating an entire episode to the updated Harvard Oxalate list that came out actually in late 2023. I'm a bit late getting my list in this podcast out, but better late than never. Which is really exciting. So if you haven't heard of the Harvard Oxalate list, which I imagine many of you have, because I feel like the word Harvard Oxalate list is thrown out quite a bit in kidney stone communities and in oxalate communities, certainly. So it's a big deal because the Harvard Oxalate list is generally considered to be the gold standard when it comes to figuring out exactly how much oxalate is in food, which, as I'll talk a little bit more about later, is a very difficult thing to do. So historically, there still is massive amounts of just oxalate misinformation floating around. And in 2002, I believe, Harvard decided to do something about it. And so they tested a whole bunch of different foods. And they tested them accurately. So we would know how much oxalate is in these foods. And this Harvard Oxalate list has sort of become since then to be the gold standard of how much oxalate is in food. I know that this list was used at the University of Chicago, where I worked before, where there is a world-renowned stone prevention program. I know that it's used in research, and it just generally is considered to be this really accurate oxalate list. So it's a really big deal because 2002 was quite some time ago that they updated the Harvard Oxalate list at the end of the year in 2003, in the fall, I believe, of 2003. And so this is great because this hasn't been done in quite some time. And we know that actually Harvard partnered with some oxalate researchers at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, where I am actually doing some consultant work. I am working with them to create research menus for their oxalate studies. I'm looking at the gut microbiome and oxalate and all sorts of other really cool stuff. So it's kind of fun that I know the researchers that did the work to actually measure the oxalate content of the foods that they measured for this updated Harvard oxalate list. So anyway, so this list was released, and it is exciting because it is really, as I said, hard to know accurately how much oxalate is in food. I will talk a little bit later about if I feel like this is really important for those of you listening to this podcast, but for the purposes of research and just interest, I think it is interesting to know as accurately as possible how much oxalate is in there. So you probably know that the oxalate list that I have as a free resource for people in my community, people who come to my website or listening to my podcast or find me on social media, all of that information is based on the Harvard Oxalate list. And so I updated my list with this updated list from Harvard just this week. I just sent it out to my email list, and I will absolutely put a link in the show notes for you, if you don't have it already, to get my updated list with that Harvard information on it. And the reason that I take that information and put it into my format is because I I feel like sometimes the portion sizes that Harvard uses aren't quite the same as much as I would prefer them to be, because I'm a very type A dietitian, which we tend to be. So I just wanted to make them a little bit more standardized. I also kind of classify them a little bit differently, and I just tried to lay it out for you in a way that I felt would be as helpful as possible to you. And so that is why I don't just share that list directly. I just kind of make it look a little bit more user friendly, at least I think so, for people in my community. So I will absolutely put a link for you to get that oxalate list again if you don't have it already. So it's very exciting that this list was released. And I wanted to take this again as an opportunity to talk a little bit about why figuring out how much oxalate is in food is so stinking confusing. And then at the end, talk a little bit more about if I feel that this is really necessary for us to know from a clinical person out there living in the world with kidney stones standpoint. I think from a research standpoint, it's very, very important, but I question whether it's really that important for those of us that are trying to prevent kidney stones. And I'll talk more about that later. So I think there's four big reasons why figuring out how much oxalate is in food is so difficult. And the first reason is that I think, or that I know, is that it's really difficult to measure oxalate in food. And apparently, the way that they used to measure oxalate and get estimates of how much oxalate is in food, is not wasn't accurate. We now know better and do it differently. But apparently, that the way that they measured oxalate previously wasn't good, and it resulted in a lot of completely false, incorrect information. Unfortunately, that information was already out in the world, already on handouts from doctors' offices, which unfortunately many doctors' offices are still using. If you have a oxalate low oxalate diet handout that looks like it's been photocopied since 1965, then probably this information is inaccurate. But anyway, so we know that this information wasn't accurate, but it was again just out there, and that information hasn't really been removed. And so this information has just kind of been perpetuated, and it's still out there on very well respected, reputable sources. Again, handouts that you might get from your doctor or from the ER or from a nurse, information that you're going to find on blogs from very big hospitals, wonderful hospitals, but just well-meaning writers who don't know that this is the case, just kind of have perpetuated this completely false misinformation about oxalate from that bad information that was collected early on. So that I think is one reason. The second reason is it's just, then this is actually true for all nutrients in foods, but it's especially true for oxalate. The amount of oxalate, even in an apple, can be dramatically different. There's going to be different oxalate based on the variety of apple. There's going to be different oxalate based on where that apple was harvested. So an apple grown in Michigan, say, could be very, very different than an apple that was grown in Washington. When that apple was picked is also going to impact how much oxalate is in it. When you eat that apple, so like the ripeness of that apple or avocado or banana or whatever it is you're eating, that can impact the amount of oxalate that's in there. And so, and cooking, procedures or cooking techniques can also alter the oxalate content. And so it's just really, really difficult to say like that there's X amount of oxalate in an apple. And as you might imagine, trying to come up with these lists of the thousands of different foods that people eat and the gajillion different ways that we might eat them from different places, prepared in different ways. Obviously, we can't feasibly create a list that goes through all of these different scenarios. And so again, this is true for all nutrition information. It is impossible, literally impossible, to know exactly how much oxalate you're eating or exactly how much potassium you're eating or protein or any of these other things. But oxalate is especially true, because it's not on food labels. And so, trying to figure out how much oxalate is in like a bread that you buy is impossible to do. But in addition, oxalate is just not a super stable molecule. And so that's why you see such drastic differences based on all those scenarios that I just talked about. So that I think is another reason why it's just really, really difficult to know how much oxalate is in food, because sure, maybe, Joe Schmo tested this apple from Michigan, but another one tested this apple from California or whatever. You get the idea, right? And this results in just dramatically different amounts of oxalate that you're actually eating compared to what you think you're eating based on these lists that were created. Another reason why figuring out how much oxalate in food is so confusing is because I think that just lazy information has been perpetuated. And let me explain what I mean a little bit more about that. So, I feel like endlessly you'll see on, kidney stone prevention handouts that you get from your doctor, it'll say some statement like green leafy vegetables, nuts, seeds, and beans are high in oxalate. So we should eat them, right? That's what that implies. And that's just lazy because there are massive differences in the amount of oxalate in green leafy vegetables, massive differences in different beans and nuts and seeds. And so somehow we've just kind of gotten lazy in how we convey this information. Again, I feel like a lot of this comes from really big websites and these, fancy handouts that were fancy, say in 1973. And like, so this notion that beans are high in oxalate, therefore they're bad for kidney stones, is just like not even questioned anymore. And that's just not the case. There's, again, massive differences. Like spinach, for example, is a green leafy vegetable and is notoriously very high in oxalate. There's no doubting that. However, most green leafy vegetables are actually very low in oxalate. Arugula, romaine, cabbage, endive, like tons and tons of green leafy vegetables are going to be low. Honestly, just spinach and Swiss chard are the only two um, pretty high green leafy vegetables. On the bean front, things like navy beans, yeah, they're high in oxalate. But pinto beans and black beans and kidney beans aren't really that high. There's massive differences, like literally, like 4 or 5 times fold differences in the oxalate. And so to just say that all beans are high in oxalate is just lazy and simply not true. So that's another reason. And then the last reason that I think that it is very difficult to figure out if a food is high or low oxalate, and this I think might be the biggest reason, is that there's no definition of what a high oxalate food is, just like there's no definition of what a low oxalate diet is. When I say definition, there is no like cutoff of what a high oxalate food is. So, like for sodium, for example, the FDA has defined what a low sodium food is, which is less than 140 milligrams of sodium per serving. But for oxalate, we're just making it up. And you're going to get different answers from literally every single dietitian you talk to, every doctor you talk to, every influencer out there you might be listening to about oxalate. You're going to get a different answer from every single person. And so, even if we could know exactly how much oxalate is in a food, so maybe we'll use like a carrot, for example. I think one carrot has like 10 milligrams of oxalate or something. Don't quote me on that. But even if we knew that this carrot has 10 milligrams of oxalate, which we don't for all the reasons I talked about before, um, who tends to be not a big fan of low oxalate diets, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, might say that, yeah, 10 milligrams of oxalate is literally nothing to worry about. That's fine. That's definitely a low oxalate vegetable. But someone else might say, oh, no, we shouldn't be eating any oxalate. 10 milligrams of oxalate is a lot. That's a high oxalate vegetable. Whereas another person might say, that's somewhere in the middle. And so, um, so you can see if you just Google like, are carrots high in oxalate? You're just looking for a black and white answer. There's no gray area. There's no definition of what that means. And so that's resulted in this endless conversation that I see online that honestly is heartbreaking because it ends up causing people to miss out on a lot of very, very healthy foods. When people say, is this high in oxalate? You're going to get this answer like, yes, it's high in oxalate because someone read somewhere that 10 milligrams of oxalate was too much. And then you're going to cut carrots out of your diet and plus endless other foods. So I hope that, that makes sense. I feel like there's, I get very passionate about this and I feel like there's so many different reasons why figuring out how much oxalate is in your foods is just really, really impossible to do. And honestly, I question whether it's even necessary to know exactly how much oxalate is in your food. Um, why? Because there's literally no data out there that shows that eating less oxalate or a low oxalate diet is linked to a lower risk of stones. Not one. Not one study has found that people who eat less oxalate have less kidney stones. In fact, every study that I have ever seen shows completely the opposite, that people who eat a healthy diet that includes lots of fruits, vegetables, and whole grains have a lower risk of stones. So we know that diets that have lots of fruits, vegetables, and whole grains in them are inevitably going to have a lot of oxalate in them, right? That's just like that's where oxalate comes from. And so every single study shows that there is a lower risk of stones in people who eat these relatively high oxalate diets. So you might be thinking like, how in the world, like what, like, how does this make any sense? How can eating more oxalate be a good thing for stone prevention? And I think that's because there are oxalate is only a very, very small part of the story. When we look at the foods that are high in oxalate, these foods are actually very, very good for stone prevention because they have a lot of things in them that are good for kidney stone prevention, ironically. So, a low oxalate diet is going to cut out a lot of things that are actually very, very good for kidney stone prevention. Some of the things that I always talk about, and I'll, kind of quickly go over in this episode, are things like magnesium is a very potent inhibitor of oxalate stones. Something called phytate is an incredibly strong inhibitor of calcium-based stones. Actually, probably like 10 times more potent inhibitor of oxalate stones than citrate, which is something we talk about all the time and why people are just blindly told to drink lemon juice all the time. But really, phytate might be an even bigger deal. A low oxalate diet is going to be it's going to make it really, really difficult to get enough fiber in. And we know that fiber is really, really important for our gut microbiome to support a healthy, diverse, abundant, community of bacteria in our intestines. And we're learning more and more about how important that gut microbiome is in kidney stone prevention every single day. That's actually a lot of the research that's going on at the University of Alabama at Birmingham that with that group that I'm working with. Um, Also, alkali. So we know that pH and acid base balance comes into play a huge deal, a huge amount with kidney stone prevention. And alkali comes exclusively from fruits and vegetables in your diet. And so when we cut out significantly the types of fruits and vegetables that you can have on a low oxalate diet, it makes it very, very difficult to get in enough alkali to kind of help support a healthy pH balance, essentially, of your urine. Um, and so when we look at this bigger picture, we know that eating a low oxalate diet or cutting back how much oxalate you're eating is absolutely going to lower the amount of oxalate in your urine, which you might think, cool, Melanie, like, why wouldn't I do that? But the question is, at what expense? And I would argue, and many, many other people much smarter than me would argue, that cutting out oxalate or even reducing oxalate is also going to is going to lower a lot of very, very good things in your urine that are preventing stones, which is why likely we see a lower risk of stones in people who are eating pretty high oxalate dietary patterns. Again, because they're also rich in so many of these really, really powerful stone inhibitors. And so it's kind of this, risk benefit equation here. If you could do something, if you could, go on a low oxalate diet and it wouldn't impact any of these other things, I would say, sure, absolutely, let's do it. But it does. And I have true reason to be concerned that going on a low oxalate diet could actually make kidney stones worse for all of these reasons. So I actually have a blog about that. So I will absolutely post a link to those details or to that blog post in the show notes. I talk a lot more about this, relationship between low oxalate diets or lack of relationship between low oxalate diets and kidney stone prevention in episode 30 of the podcast that's titled Why Shouldn't Everyone Follow a Low Oxalate Diet to Be Safe? So if you want to hear me talk even more about the potential dangers of a low oxalate diet and why you may not want to do that, definitely check out episode 30. I think I also, of course, this episode would not be complete without talking a little bit about calcium, because I'm not telling you to go out and eat all the spinach in the world and you'll be totally fine. I think oxalate does matter, but the key is to make sure that we're eating these healthy, higher oxalate foods in a healthy, well-balanced diet that includes enough calcium. Because we know that when we eat calcium in our food, especially when we have that calcium with our meals that are hopefully high in oxalate, because hopefully you're eating lots of fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, our body isn't going to absorb that oxalate anyway. It's going to absorb much, much less oxalate than if you didn't have that calcium there. And so in study after study after study, we see people who consume enough dairy, aka enough calcium, and who consume lots of fruits and vegetables that have all this really good stuff for kidney stone prevention, those are the people that have the lowest risk of forming stones. And so just to kind of tie this whole episode together, I feel like I went off on 75 tangents during that episode. I'm really excited that there is this updated list from Harvard, because accurate information is always good, right? I think that there definitely is a time and place where it might be useful to know how much oxalate is in food, but do I think that it matters for you, the listener out there who is doing everything they can to prevent stones? I really don't think that's the case. Of course, I would have to look at your 24-hour urine test to really understand what's going on. But even if your urine oxalate is high, most of the time, 9 times out of 10, if we just simply get in enough calcium, we see that oxalate come tumbling down, and we have no reason to be concerned with how much oxalate you eat. There's also lots of other things that could cause high urine oxalate, things like excessive vitamin C supplementation, actually eating too much fructose, not fruit, but like in the form of like high fructose corn syrup, that can drive up urine oxalate. Eating too much non-dairy animal protein, even though it's free of oxalate, just like vitamin C supplements, your liver can make oxalate from excessive animal protein, specifically that non-dairy animal protein. And I talk about that in previous episodes as well. So every single scenario, basically, even if you have that high urine oxalate to begin with, there's other things that we can do to help get that urine oxalate down that are going to be a whole lot healthier for you and a whole lot more effective at kidney stone prevention than a low oxalate diet. So, um, All right, that was a lot of information. That's everything I have for today. But if you are interested, definitely check out that link to get the updated Harvard list, just so you can check it out, maybe see some of the differences. And in that list, I also updated kind of my intro, where I have a section that's called like how to use this list. And I talk a little bit more about everything that I just talked about on this episode, just because I don't want people to get this list and then see it as like, oh, these high oxalate foods are, quote, bad for me because I have stones, and these low oxalate ones are, quote, good for me. Because as we know, there is a ton more to kidney stone prevention than oxalate. Because even, everything, of course, has to be individualized to your 24-hour urine test. And most of the time, things like drinking enough water, not eating too much salt, not eating too much protein, getting in enough calcium, maybe thinking a little bit about sugar. These things are so much more important than oxalate. So with that, I will end this episode of the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast, and I hope to see you next week. And happy 4th of July to everyone celebrating. Have a good one. Thank you for listening to today's episode. For more help with kidney stones, check out my website, www.thekidneydietitian.org. For more personalized help from me, check out my online course, Kidney Stone Nutrition School. VIP enrollment includes help directly from me. I can't wait to see you there and help you prevent kidney stones. Have a great day.